Hello, I'm Philip Schofield. I'm Director of the Bentham Project in UCL's Faculty of Laws and General Editor of the new authoritative edition of the collected works of Jeremy Bentham. Bentham, the philosopher and reformer, was born in 1748. He died in 1832, and he left around 100,000 pages of manuscripts, which are now deposited in the UCL Library and the British Library. And I'm going to talk today about Bentham's working methods to try and get an insight into his thought processes. The first thing to say is that Bentham was regarded as a child genius. He was learning Greek and Latin at the ages of 3 and 4. His father realised that he had a prodigy on his hands and sent him to Oxford University at the age of 12. But in the end, he was very contemptuous of the learning he received at Oxford. He said it was dominated by theology and dead languages. So in what sense can we see Bentham as an inspiration for UCL? Well, it follows from his writings on education, a work called Chrestomathea, which he published in the mid-1810s. Bentham reflected on his experience at Oxford and thought, education should be concerned with useful subjects, and that's what the term Chrestomathea means, the study of useful topics, useful disciplines. And it was those ideas in Chrestomathea, which is a really profound work, that influenced the radicals and Whigs who came together to found the University of London, which became, of course, University College London, when eventually it amalgamated with King's in 1836. One of the remarkable things about Bentham was that he was brought up in a very conservative household. His father was a member of the Church of England. His father sent him to Westminster School, and then he went to the Tory University of Oxford, and his father earmarked him for a career in the law. And yet he became one of the most radical thinkers this country has ever produced. In the end, Bentham ended up criticising the whole, what he called monarchical, aristocratical establishment. So how did this come about? Well, it was a gradual process, at least politically, but one key year was 1769, when Bentham was 21 years old. He had qualified as a barrister on his 21st birthday, again showing his precocity. That was the earliest time you were permitted to become a barrister. But he became a barrister at Lincoln's Inn, and he was given some briefs. And one was an action for debt. And he worked out that if the client pursued the action, the costs that he would have to pay to the lawyers and the courts would outweigh the amount of money he would recover. And so he started thinking that there's something wrong with this system. And that set him off on his lifelong career of writing and thinking primarily about law, but of course that took him in all sorts of directions, from poor law reform to prisons and eventually to politics. Bentham was very fortunate in that, particularly after his father died in the early 1790s, he inherited a large house in Westminster, an even larger garden and property. He lived quite frugally, but he had enough resources to maintain a life of writing and thinking. He didn't make any money from publishing. It wasn't until 1802 that Bentham became well known. This was through the writings that were published by his French editor, Etienne Dumont, the Traité de législation civile et pénale, theory of legislation, was published in France in 1802 in elegant French, not in Bentham's English, and that became a bestseller and established Bentham's reputation. Dumont produced 5 of these recensions or editions of Bentham's works, and some of them were were translated into other languages as well, such as German, Spanish, even Russian. Bentham published about 45 or 50 works, but once he published a work, he would destroy the manuscripts. So what we have in the manuscripts are texts, works he didn't publish. One of the striking features about the early Bentham, and I'm thinking now in the 1770s, is a series of manuscripts which he called insurrender, that is, things that should be inserted. He would write ideas as they came into his head. For instance, one set of these insurrender are called preparatory principles, and these were the preparatory principles for a penal code. And the material consists of either 2 or 3 sentences or sometimes 3, 4, 5 pages on related topics, not in any particular order. And when he was going to write a coherent, linear text, he would read through his insurrender, having made an index, and incorporate the relevant parts into a relevant chapter or section. So it was a way of thinking about the material as it occurred to him, and then, secondly, ordering it into a more coherent text. But his practice of writing insurrender disappears, and in his later writings, he employs a different method. Rather than writing out ideas in detail as they occurred to him, he would write very short, what he called rudiments. And so his starting point for any particular work was what he described as sheets of rudiments. And these pages are ruled into 4 columns each. So you get 8 columns across the page, and he puts a heading at the top of the column and then writes relevant ideas in a much more organised way. But then you find him changing the numbering or adding in extra points as they occurred to him. So that was the first stage in his working method. He would draw up the rudiments, and from them he would draw up a plan for a particular work. And then he would start writing it, but not necessarily at the start and go to the end. Quite why he started, where he started, who knows. He would pick a particular section or chapter and write a series of pages of text. He would probably write 13, 15 pages a day, of course, using a quill and ink, and he would put, if we think now about after 1800, let's say, he would put a date on the manuscript and a heading, a main heading, and then in the margin he would place a subheading, and then write his text on composition paper, written on one side of the paper to facilitate arrangement. And he would go over the text and correct it. So you see interlineations in the text where the editor has to decide whether it's an addition or an alternative to what's in the text. Following that, he would write what he called marginal contents or marginal summaries in the margin. So these would be very short, pithy summaries of the content of the text itself. One of his secretaries would then copy these marginal summaries onto marginal content sheet. So these were again ruled into 4 columns. And so he would be able to see the whole content of a particular chapter or section of a work at one glance. And he would use these marginal content sheets in order to organise the work as a whole. He always had an audience in mind, whether it was an individual in a few instances, but mainly the public generally. But as one of his friends says, Mr. Bentham's always running on from one good scheme to an even better one. So this almost sometimes an inability to finish things. And he thought, I'll leave them to an editor. And he often didn't feel like he had to finish the work off. He would leave it to a disciple. He left his manuscripts. The ideas were there. They could put them into some sort of form. So in fact, what the Bentham Project is doing is sort of picking up on what Bentham wanted, and that was for editors to create his works from the manuscripts he'd left. One of the things about studying Bentham, even if you don't agree with his utilitarianism or with his ideas, he does teach you how to think.